This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome to NC Spin. I'm Brad Crone, sitting in for Tom Campbell. This week we put a spotlight on the special session. It's Election Central, where we take a look at congressional, judicial, and legislative elections across North Carolina. And of course, our panel is going to tell us something we don't know. It's another week of NC Spin. Joining us on our panel this week, Becki Gray with the John Locke Foundation, John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, Chris Fitzsimon, political analyst and columnist, and Rufus Edmisten, former Secretary of State and Attorney General. We begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
Did you know 80% of North Carolina's harvest is made into food products in other states? That's why food scientists at NC State are partnering with industry and government to turn local crops into North Carolina products, creating new opportunities for our farmers and businesses and adding jobs in rural communities. At NC State, what we think and do grows our economy from seed to supermarket. Discover how we're growing new food opportunities. Visit wegrownc.ncsu.edu.
Production underwriting support provided in part by the more than 65,000 members of the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
Topic 1 this week, the special session. State lawmakers drove back into Raleigh this past week for a brief special session to deal with short titles for the 6 constitutional amendments on the ballot. Becki Gray, explain to us what just happened and why.
Well, Brad, according to a 1983 statute that was passed, there is a Constitutional Publication Commission that consists of the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and the Director of Legislative Services, whose job it is to provide captions for the constitutional amendments. Once the General Assembly had passed legislation that would put, as you mentioned, 6 constitutional amendments on the ballot, the question became, what do those captions look like? We have a short time frame in which to do this, from the short session to when the ballots actually have to be printed. So there was some immediacy to this. The General Assembly continued to become frustrated with what became this law that passed in 1983. In 2018, what that means is there were 2 Democrats on that commission, 1 Republican. There was a delay in their even beginning their work. Then there were a lot of activity out and about the partisan nature of what those might look like. The General Assembly really very quickly just said, you know what, we're coming in, we're going to handle that. That's what this special session was all about.
Chris, did we just see the man standing behind the elephant cleaning up a big mess?
Well, I think we did, and surely the General Assembly knew that this commission existed. They should have. They actually addressed it in legislation since the Republicans have been in power. It was clearly, they were worried. They were charging some kind of conspiracy with outside groups. Some people were blaming it on Jerry Cohen and having a conspiracy with Elaine Marshall, who's on the commission, which is insane. Also, so that was one thing. The second thing they did, and we're going to talk about judicial elections in a while, is they tried to clean up their own mess because there's a Democrat who switched to be a Republican. They're worried about how it's going to affect the Supreme Court. So they actually passed a law. First of all, remember, they eliminated the primary. Usually the way you weed out these people is with a primary. They eliminated the primary in judicial races. Then they were worried that they were going to lose the Supreme Court race, so they changed it after the fact, which I think is probably unconstitutional, which I'll defer to the lawyer here. So this was nothing but a political cleanup session because they were worried about the partisan impact of what they had already done.
Rufus, throughout your career, you've seen a number of constitutional amendments. 1982 comes to mind for me. Keep the 2-Year Term Committee led by Tom Gilmore. That was the last constitutional amendment in the state that I believe failed. We've never seen 6 constitutional amendments on the ballot. What does it mean?
Well, I'm a minimalist when it comes to that. I learned that from Senator Sam Ervin. You don't monkey with the Constitution to make it an everyday event. It's almost like this is a state fair, and we're throwing in there as many constitutional amendments as we can think of. It's not good policy. It is a lot of diversion here of attempting to throw in things like hunting and fishing. I mean, who's against hunting and fishing? I'm from a a wildlife family. My father was a wildlife protector for 32 years. And then who is going to be against victims' compensation? These are things that can all be dealt with very quickly with legislation. So what it's all about is some gamesmanship, and I think my dear friend Becki is a little bit too easy on what they were doing.
Brad, I think there was a more recent constitutional amendment was defeated. I believe there was an attempt initially to authorize local governments to use tax increment financing, and it failed, and then they did it again, and it passed. But the reason I bring that up is that it illustrates the importance of the wording on a ballot. I believe the first time, and it may have been more than one time, that was an attempt to get tax increment financing, which is a financing vehicle that basically involves allowing local governments to capture the increment, the additional property taxes that might come from a development, and use that to pay it off. The original time that it failed is because it had tax financing on the ballot, and people thought, well, they're raising my taxes, so they changed the wording. And it passed. It didn't say tax increment financing on the ballot that time. That illustrates the importance of what is literally on the ballot and what people respond to. I think that the legislature was responding maybe to rumors, maybe to not have information. But what really struck me is the Democrats had some legitimate criticisms of this session, but then they went on to say the Republicans were attempting to mislead the voters by having a special session and writing their own captions. And when it became obvious that wasn't going to happen, they kept sending out fundraising. They're trying to mislead the voters. In this particular instance, getting rid of the captions, which is essentially what they did, could not possibly mislead the voters. It reduced the chances that anybody might be misled by an inaccurate caption.
Well, Chris, when that all shakes out, what's going to be the politics?
Well, the Republicans are open. The politics will get, these amendments will get people to the polls. I do think the process by which it was, at the very least, Republicans were incompetent because they didn't realize who was, or didn't think about who was going to be writing the captions. At the worst, this was a political maneuver. I think some people will see through that. They're banking on the average voter not seeing through it. I think the judicial question is a much bigger one for them, which is I do think a court will likely find that move unconstitutional and will leave Chris Anglin on the ballot, which makes it harder for them to retain that Supreme Court seat.
Well, I think as you sit right now, doesn't it just say constitutional amendment? That's all they ended up doing, right?
Yes, but then the text of the amendment is on the ballot.
And the text of the amendment was part of the legislation that passed. So, you know, that's where it comes. So the question becomes,
going to be extremely forwarded.
Right, the question, exactly, but the question becomes, so, I mean, how much additional information does the public need, and what's the responsibility for us as voters?
Well, the other thing is, though, that this is one of the few times the legislature hasn't detailed how these things will be put in place after the amendment is passing. For example, what kind of voter ID does this mean? In the past, we've had language that goes with the amendment so people have an idea. We don't know what kind of voter ID they're going to pass. They're going to do that after the election.
Enabling legislation will be critically important.
Exactly right.
Around the horn. Let's go around the horn. How many constitutional amendments pass and how many fail?
I think 5 pass, 1 fails.
I think 3 or 4 will pass.
I think 4 will pass, 2 will fail.
I'll go with 5 will pass and 1 might not.
All right. In 15 weeks, voters in North Carolina will go to the polls to elect delegates to Congress, 170 members of our state legislature, a Supreme Court justice, and 3 Court of Appeals judges, and we'll also be voting on the 6 constitutional amendments. So let's take a look at the competitive congressional elections across North Carolina. Chris, nationally, Democrats are licking their chops, thinking they're going to take back over the United States House. Does that run through North Carolina?
Well, I think it might. I think there's the 9th District in North Carolina from Charlotte through Union County and out that way. Dan McGrady, I think, has a real chance to beat Mark Harris, who defeated incumbent Robert Pittenger. It's a Republican district. There's a poll recently that showed McGrady with a significant advantage. The generic poll, the last June Civitas poll, had Democrats up on the generic ballot significantly. Nationally, we've seen that. I think there's a generic ballot, there's the national signs of this past week's events with President Trump, I think, play an important role. And it's also important to think about the enthusiasm. I do think Democrats at this point, again, this is July, the end of July, are more motivated. I do think the fact that these districts are tightly gerrymandered in North Carolina make it unlikely there'll be a larger gain than that.
John, the 9th Congressional District has all eyes on it at the state level and the national level. What's the impact of the bitter primary you had back in May where Pittenger got beat by Reverend Harris? Does he have steam to carry that? Is it an impediment for him going forward. What's Reverend Harris's path to victory?
All other things being equal, when you have an incumbent lose to a primary challenger in a potentially competitive district, that's usually not good news, doesn't have to be disastrous news. So I have a hard time believing this isn't a bit of an impediment for the Republicans. As Chris said, there's a Democratic advantage on momentum, passion. McGrady has raised a lot of money. However, this district does still have a Republican tilt, and in particular, Mark Harris, while he has to fight for every vote in Mecklenburg County, what's really important for him is heavy turnout, strong turnout in Union County and in some of the other places where they are vote-rich for Republicans.
Rufus, another major election in the states, the newly drawn 13th Congressional District, Republican freshman Ted Budd facing Democrat Kathy Manning. Give us a preview.
Well, Brad, I think we can all say that Ted Budd has been no lightning bug on Capitol Hill. I don't think you can say that he has a great congressional record. He was a owner of a gun store, and I'm particularly enthused about the fact that this lady seems to be so energetic. And then again, I think on this ballot you're going to see a draw because of the female, which can
be a benefit.
Can be of great benefit, and nobody got to know Representative Budd, so I'm going to call that one for the lady.
Becki, 2nd Congressional District, Wake County, Harnett, Johnston, Lee, Congressman George Holding and Linda Coleman going at it tooth and toenail. How's that race?
Well, they are. And Brad, to me, of all of the 13 congressional races in North Carolina, this is the one where voters have the clearest, most distinct choice between the two candidates. George Holding, very much a conservative Republican, has advocated for work requirements, for welfare programs, has advocated for lower taxes, more opportunity, fewer regulations, more patient-driven health care reform. Some have said even some votes on that may hurt him in the election. Linda Coleman, on the other side, has really staked herself out as just the traditional left-leaning Democrat with more government services. She's for Medicaid expansion. She's for all of those minimum wage, all of those kind of things. Interestingly enough, George Holding has way outraised her. I think he's raised $2 million. She has something like $300,000 in the bank. But these are both candidates that are well known to the voters in that district. George Holding, this will be the 4th time he's run. He's won by 56-57% of the voters in the general election all 3 of the times that he's run.
What's going to be, I want to go around the table again and get everybody's input. What impact will Donald Trump have on the ballot going into November? Chris?
Oh, I think he'll have a significant ballot. I mean, as I mentioned, this has been a bad week for Trump. There could be worse weeks. I suppose there could be better weeks. I think he'll have a significant impact. The Democrats want, especially in these urban areas like where George Holding lives, not that that's his whole district, and in Charlotte. Trump is very unpopular. I think it helps the enthusiasm of the Democrats if Trump continues to stumble.
Rufus?
Well, with the exception of the race in Alabama and a couple others, President Trump's candidates have consistently won. I mean, his ability to get out the base is what counts, and I think his endorsement means a lot, tremendously amount of goodwill.
John Hood, impact Donald Trump has on elections here in North Carolina?
I think for the congressional races, it's mostly a Donald Trump election. The Democrats want it to be a Donald Trump election. The Republicans want it to be an economy election. That's really, there are other issues here and there. That's basically the choice between the two. They are each trying to make their pet issue number one.
Becki?
I think it's too early to tell, and I think that Trump, ask me in an hour and I may have a different opinion.
That is so true. The only statewide race on the ballot in November are judicial races for the state Supreme Court and the North Carolina Court of Appeals. Most of the attention will focus on the Supreme Court race with incumbent Republican Barbara Jackson facing 2 challengers, a newly minted Republican Chris Anglin and Democrat Anita Earls. John, give us a preview to the Supreme Court race.
Well, Brad, the Democrats are clearly angling to pick up that seat because Anglin is, let's face it, he is a candidate who flipped from Democratic to Republican shortly before filing. He is, we all know Perry Woods, his campaign consultant, is a nice fellow. He's definitely a Democrat.
My good friend.
Let's not be silly about this.
Right.
Now, leading into this cycle, though, Republicans, as Chris mentioned, had not created judicial primaries for the Court of Appeals, Supreme Court, even though they were partisan, which created this possibility. And there was speculation, and who knows, maybe even some serious attempts by Republicans to recruit some Democrats to change parties and go in to split the Democratic vote. That didn't happen. Instead, it went the other way, not only the Supreme Court, but there were some multiple Republicans in the Court of Appeals. So I think that the legislature recognized they had created a problem. And ironically, this is a situation where if this is a problem, and there is a legitimate ex post facto question and all that, but the risk here is that voters might not get their way. In other words, you would have voters who are voting for somebody under false pretenses. The legislature's solution may not be the right solution. There really was a problem, and it is odd to call what the legislature did an attack on democracy. It might be an attack on something else, but in this case, truth in labeling is important. Now, the best solution to truth in labeling is a primary. So if you have a sort of a fake Democrat or fake Republican, then there's a chance for the voters in the primary to nominate the person that really represents the party's views.
Rufus, did the legislature get too cute in trying to design
they outfoxed
the
themselves. Cutesy is not even a good enough word for it. Here went the fox trotting down the pathway. And the big thing I take from this is we shouldn't have to be even sitting here talking about judicial races, which is supposed to present an impartial forum for people to settle disputes and try criminal cases. And yet today, we put as much time on this show today on the judicial race for Supreme Court as we have anything else, and that shows you what we've come to today, which is a shame that they've become so partisan. They should be appointed.
Chris, what's your forecast on the legal standing of what the legislature did when it comes to the labeling of the Supreme Court race?
I'll defer to my old boss, Dan Blue, who also stood and loudly, I thought, appropriately criticized this. So you cannot change the rules of the election after the election has started, which is in effect after filing is closed, and you can't go back and say, oh, you're not eligible to run this way because we've changed the rules. Otherwise, you could continue to change the rules again. I'd be surprised if this wasn't thrown out, and if Chris Anglin is not back on the ballot as a Republican.
There was some speculation going into the session that the Republicans might attempt to address the problem by creating a 50% plus one standard. In other words, creating the possibility of a runoff after November. I'm not sure that would have been subject to the same kind of constitutional challenge,
right.
But for whatever reason, they decided not to go that route, but to go this other route.
Becki, what's at stake here on the Supreme Court race?
There's a tremendous amount at stake. I mean, as Rufus alluded to, I mean, I think this is the most important election that we have in North Carolina. And you look at the cases that have come before the Supreme Court just in the last couple of years that have to do with education, that have to do with election, have to do with powers of separation. I mean, the whole structure of our state government, social issues that many people care about, fiscal issues. I mean, all of those, ultimately, the General Assembly can do all these things. They can pass laws we either like or don't like. But, as we've just talked about, many of these are going to end up before the Supreme Court. That's kind of where the buck stops, literally. This is the most important race in North Carolina.
Well, I have to say, in my career as Attorney General and Secretary of State, which spanned some 28 years, you never thought about the courts very much. They were people lofty up there in the third floor of the Justice Building where I held court for 10 years. And now it's such an integral part of our fabric that you have to pay attention to it. And money's even creeping in there now. That is what is bothering me.
There's no doubt they are the arbitrators between the two parties and the partisanship we're seeing in the state.
And they have such a heavy role now when they didn't before.
North Carolina's legislative elections will be the mother of all campaigns. Democrats have been locked out of power for so long they can't remember the layouts of the leadership offices. Can the Democrats break the supermajority? Rufus Edmisten, our friend Thad Ure, used to proudly say he was the oldest rat in the barn. Well, you're the senior fella here at the table today. How important are these legislative elections?
Are you saying I'm getting rattier by the day?
We're all getting older. Gray hair is valuable.
Well, wasn't that a case? This is a milestone race. There is no question about it. Even there is some talk of not only breaking the supermajority for veto purposes, but the Democrats taking over the House, which I don't think is going to happen. However, it will determine, in my opinion, along with the Supreme Court race, as Becki said, where the state is going to go for a number of years. Census is coming up in 2020. Oh, how important that is. And if anybody wants to study something and be a good intern like the young man I met with you, they need to study this race for the control of the General Assembly, because it will be the most significant thing that's happened in a long time.
Let's look into the legislative elections specifically in Wake County. Chris, give us a preview.
Well, I think the Wake County and Mecklenburg County are the two areas that are the most likely for Democrats to have pickups. I think some incumbents, well-known incumbents like Nelson Dollar in the Raleigh-Cary area running against a former PTA president is vulnerable. The Chris Malone race, I think, will be very interesting. There's a rematch with Representative Joe John and Marilyn Avila, which was very close. I think that in many ways, there's no way the Democrats are going to even break the supermajority unless they make big gains in Wake County and Mecklenburg County.
It's important to remember what we mean by break the supermajority for the viewers. Currently 75 members of the House who are Republicans. 72 would be that 3/5. So the Democrats have got to have a net flip of 4 seats in the House, 6 seats, I believe, in the Senate to break the supermajority. 6 seats in the Senate, there's only 10 or 11 that are competitive. You know, that's possible, but not as obvious. The House one, as Chris says, if the Democrats in Wake and Mecklenburg County turn out in high numbers, they have every real possibility of breaking that supermajority.
Are you seeing any indication that the wave is beyond Wake and Mecklenburg County for the Democrats?
That's a good question.
Do they get to 55, 56 seats? I mean, or I was talking with a very prominent GOP operative this week who said they're fearful they could lose the state house. I'm not seeing that in any of the data that I'm seeing. You have any news to report?
No, I believe some of them are looking at national data in other states, which have gotten worse for the Republicans, I think, in recent weeks. It's certainly possible, Brad. I mean, there are some other races outside of Wake and Mecklenburg that everybody stipulates are competitive.
I just want to jump in really. That Civitas poll I referenced earlier in June had the Democrats up at least 7 or 8 points in the generic ballot for the General Assembly. That's a big margin. I don't know if that'll hold. If they're up 8 or 9 points in the generic ballot, they could make much bigger gains in the supermajority.
Becki, one of the races that people are talking about is the President Pro Tem's race up in Rockingham County.
Yeah, the challenger to that, I can't remember.
Jim Mangrum.
Jim Mangrum. Yeah, and there's been a residency conflict with that I believe have been resolved at this point. But yeah, I mean, I think that says a lot about what the Democrats think their chances are, is that they have a very a legitimate candidate going after the highest ranking, probably the most powerful man in North Carolina. I think there's something there. But I also think that in some of these races outside of Wake County, what you're going to be seeing is a focus on some of the local issues. I know in the Ted Davis House race down in the Wilmington area, the Gen X issue is, you know, kind of the key issue there, where it's very different in Wake County and places like that. So I think that too you will see, that's always the case, but I think you'll see Democrats really going after some of those local issues and focusing, where in Wake and Mecklenburg and some of the bigger ones, it's sort of the generic teacher pay, taxes, Medicaid, those kind of things that
I think,
they're
Brad,
applying.
If you see the President Pro Tem of the Senate defeated, you can see a wide-scale wipeout.
And the Speaker may, I mean, Speaker's got a David Brinkley down in Kings Mountains running against him. So the top leadership in the state both have competitive elections.
Well, and what happens with that too is whether they win or not, it distracts them that they have to stay in their district. They have, rather than being out helping members of their caucus, also money that they've raised that they would rather be putting into winning some of those competitive races. They're going to have to spend some time and some money and some resources right at home that they'd rather not be doing.
Did you say David Brinkley?
David Brinkley was running.
I think there was a newscaster one time.
Former
with that
newscaster.
name.
He's clearly got name ID for sure. Well, folks, we've come to the part of the show where one of my favorites, most viewers like it too, where our panelists get a chance to tell us something they don't know. We'll start with John Hood this week.
Brad, a few days ago, the latest numbers came out on gross domestic product for every state, including North Carolina. Not a great report for North Carolina in general. For over the last 12 months, we haven't actually beaten the national average in economic growth, a little higher than the regional average, but not the national average. But one thing that really stuck out to me is how manufacturing is following a different course. In the last 12 months, North Carolina's manufacturing sector has grown by, I think, 5.2% after inflation. The national average was 3.5%. Manufacturing, particularly in some of our heavy manufacturing traditional places like the Hickory Metro, the Triad Metro, is actually having at least a modest comeback.
Rufus?
Congressman Walter Jones has filed a complaint with the State Elections Board last week. I helped a little bit with that, against his primary opponent, saying that absolutely this nasty campaigning has to stop. I think it's one of the first times ever, and I hope you'll read the complaint.
Becki?
C.D. Spangler died this week, which I think has kind of made all of us focus again on the Board of Governors, on higher education, the university system. There is some real disruption going on in the Board of Governors, something to keep an eye on.
Chris?
NC Policy Watch reported this past week the General Assembly gave a $5 million pass-through grant for beach renourishment study in Winston-Salem to something called the Resources Institute that has no experience doing that. This story will keep developing.
You've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read Tom's weekly column, visit our website at ncspin.com or catch NC Spin on Facebook. Join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Did you know 80% of North Carolina's harvest is made into food products in other states? That's why food scientists at NC State are partnering with industry and government to turn local crops into North Carolina products, creating new opportunities for our farmers and businesses and adding jobs in rural communities. At NC State, what we think and do grows our economy from seed to supermarket. Discover how we're growing new food opportunities. Visit wegrownc.ncsu.edu.
Production underwriting support provided in part by the more than 65,000 members of the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.